Tashi Delay. You're listening to Tibet Unlocked, the podcast. My name is Ladin Tetong. I'm a Tibetan, I'm an activist, and I am here today with Tendor and Freya, dear friends and colleagues, to talk about Tibet Action's new report, Exposing China's Colonial Boarding School System in Tibet. Tendor is senior researcher and strategist at Tibet Action Institute. He's a leader in the Tibetan freedom movement, he's a writer, and he's currently doing his PhD in political science at Columbia University. Freya Putt is director of strategy at Tibet Action. She's been leading strategic campaigns and inspiring action for Tibet and other social, political, and environmental change movements for the past 2 decades. And she has her master's from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And she's joining us from Kelowna, British Columbia in Canada. So getting right to it. In December, Tibet Action, we released a report on China's massive colonial boarding school system in Tibet. And, we were not, at the time we started to work on this issue, we weren't sure that we were going to be writing a report. What we were doing was investigating, looking into reports from Tibet that we were hearing more and more Tibetan parents were being made to send their children, including very young children, away to boarding school against their wishes and just, feeling like pressured to do this, though they didn't want to, they didn't have any alternatives. And we heard from one Tibetan researcher that he was estimating something like 900,000 Tibetan children in all of historical Tibet in boarding schools. And that number was astounding to us, those of us who've been working on the Tibetan issue for all these years. And we just almost couldn't believe it. And so we started to try to dig into that number and to look at see what we could find. And of course, China's information blackout and lockdown of Tibet is so severe and it's so complete that any kind of research or any kind of investigation like we were trying to do is really complicated and difficult to get the true picture of what's happening on the ground. But after months and months of work, and really an international team digging into this, lo and behold, we came up with a number of at least 800 to 900,000 Tibetan children in all of historical Tibet, not just what China calls the Tibet Autonomous Region, but all 3 historical provinces of Tibet, Utsang, Amdo, and Kham, in the entire Tibet. 800 to 900,000 Tibetan children currently are separated from their families and living in these colonial boarding schools. And this number represents nearly 80% of all Tibetan children between the ages of 6 to 18, which really is astounding and disturbing. And for, I think, everyone in the Tibet movement, it's come as a real surprise or a shock. We knew there, of course, were boarding schools inside Tibet. We knew that, more and more Tibetan children from younger ages were being made to study all in Mandarin or Chinese, and were no longer getting even like the primary school education in Tibetan medium or Tibetan language instruction. But to sort of put this whole picture together and realize that these schools housing nearly all of Tibetan school-age children are, it's such a massive system and network of schools, and it's completely designed, the entire system, to not just indoctrinate these children with a sort of fully politicized curriculum and to make them loyal to the Chinese Communist Party and China above all else. But of course, they're taught by mostly Chinese teachers in Chinese language, and they don't have because they're not living with their families and their communities, they're cut off from authentic Tibetan culture. They are not able to practice Tibetan Buddhism, and they are living these very regimented lives, these very long days, just immersed in a really highly politicized Chinese education. And it's clear that the Chinese government is trying to, with these schools, turn Tibetan children into something they're not. Take their Tibetan identity and replace it with the Chinese identity. So getting to Freya and Tendor here, that's sort of the high level look at our report. Freya, do you want to just talk a little bit about some of the, the key findings, whatever, numbers or curriculum, or the fact that parents are have no choice but to send their children to these schools?
Yeah, so like you said, it is a shocking number, at least, well, over 800,000, and we think closer to 900,000. That's of 6 to 18-year-olds, and we know because there have been reports from parents inside Tibet of 4 and 5-year-olds also being sent to boarding school, but we couldn't find the numbers. But we know that the number in our report is for sure low because of that and other things. So really what we've seen is that this whole transformation, while nobody was looking over the past decade, or while nobody was able to see because of all of China's efforts to black out what's happening in Tibet, and keep it under wraps. The whole transformation of a school system. So like you said, there have been some boarding schools for a long time. Tibet's a huge place, and especially for high school, there were definitely people who were going to boarding school in years past. But in this last decade, there's been a deliberate policy on the Chinese side to consolidate schools, they call it, and shut down especially the elementary schools and middle schools, and in local villages or local areas, and merge them into the bigger, much bigger, sometimes enormous, thousands of students schools in urban areas. So there is this huge shift. Parents are left now, because of that consolidation policy, they're left with no choice because they don't have schools where they live anymore. So they have to send their kids to boarding schools. And there's also all sorts of other pressures that we heard about in the course of researching this report. Really explicit threats and intimidation, financial penalties, parents being told that their younger kids wouldn't be able to go to school if their older kids didn't go to boarding school. There's all the pressure on parents, especially in Tibet, occupied and with Tibetans so disadvantaged already under that occupation. There's so much pressure to have their kids be educated. Parents want their kids to be able to succeed as the world is changing around them completely because of China's policies largely. So they want their kids to have an education, and this is the option they have. It's no option but to send their 6-year-old away. So that's the situation that we can see with parents, and some individuals, very bravely told Tibetans in exile and researchers about the situations they've faced. Largely Tibet is such a locked down environment, and people are so under intense pressure at this point to not to rock the boat, especially under Xi Jinping's rule. So many things have become criminalized and criminal offenses now that didn't used to be. So parents also just can't protest, they can't ask. I mean, some are asking still bravely, but face huge potential repercussions from asking for their schools to stay open, or other alternatives. So that's the situation they're dealing with. And then the curriculum is even, in the beginning, some of these schools offered some Tibetan curriculum, but more and more, along with non-boarding schools there are left, the curriculum is turning into really Chinese language. All the lessons are in Chinese, but also under Xi, there's been this real focus in an even more intense way on sinicizing Tibetans and other non-Chinese people to remold these kids into kids that don't grow up with their own culture, don't grow up with their own religion, aren't able to talk to their parents and grandparents on a daily basis, are disconnected from their communities, and are subjected to propaganda nonstop in school, so that they grow up to become citizens that are loyal to the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and Tendor, maybe you could just, speak a little bit to this idea of what's the impact, I guess, of cutting kids off from their parents, families, and communities, and kind of daily life, Tibetan daily life, the experiences you would have in a family and in your village, or wherever you may be from.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think among Tibetans, it seems like there is a growing concern that this phase of Chinese government's assault on Tibet, how it is much more severe and serious than previous phases of different types of assaults. And Tibetans are very familiar with the history of China's invasion in the 50s, and then in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, the Cultural Revolution inflicted damages on Tibetan culture. And I think, for many Tibetans, this particular phase of China's assault is, in a way, much more severe than the previous two phases. The first phase being, China first invaded the land, right? They assaulted and invaded the land. And then during the Cultural Revolution, they invaded destroyed the monasteries and the temples and the kind of the material and the visible aspects of Tibetan culture. But right now, China is going after something much, much more foundational, and that is the language. And for many Tibetans, almost anyone you speak with, people usually think of Tibetan language as the foundation of Tibetan civilization. Not just, it cannot be described as just part of the culture. It is not the same as religion. Even Buddhism is being destroyed and assaulted and damaged by the Chinese government. Language somehow is even more fundamental to Tibetan identity than any of those things, right? In a given civilization, religion can come and go. Tibetans were not always Buddhist, politics comes and goes. Even culture changes over time. It evolves over time. Cultural attitudes change over time. But all of this is basically constructed on the foundation of a unique language which undergirds the entire Tibetan civilization, which is a civilization that goes back several thousands of years, right? And that's why I think for many people, the current phase of the China's assault on Tibet is extremely terrifying. And I think, the way the Chinese government, with Xi Jinping at the top, the way they are looking at the boarding schools network as a central key kind of instrument with which to destroy Tibetan identity and replace it with a Chinese identity is, in a way, an admission of defeat, in the sense that they have basically China has decided, Beijing has decided that they have failed to make the Tibetan people accept Chinese rule. So now they have basically recognized that Tibetans, as long as Tibetans remain Tibetan, they will never accept Chinese rule, right? And for the Chinese government, the only way to make the Tibetan people, or try to make the Tibetans accept Chinese rule, is by turning Tibetans into Chinese, so that the Tibetan nation or Tibetan people as a group, basically as an ethnic group, as a civilizational group, basically ceases to exist. And that's one of the definitions of genocide, you know. So yeah, this is a very terrifying moment for many Tibetans, and whether it's parents or elder generation of Tibetans, I can sense a great deal of concern. And you know, there was a phase when China first came to Tibet, Tibetans didn't understand any Chinese at all. You know, we have this great language, which is a vehicle of civilization. Some of the greatest Asian philosophies or literatures are basically captured in the Tibetan language and housed in the Tibetan language and preserved in the Tibetan language, not just in the written text, but in the great oral literature of Tibet as well. And basically, you know, Tibetans did not speak any Chinese. And then there came a phase in the 70s and 80s when a certain group of Tibetans were able to communicate in some Chinese, but Tibetan is still the biggest language in Tibet. And then later on, you know, there were some Tibetans who can speak almost better Chinese than Tibetan, but those were few in numbers. But right now, what the Chinese government is now working on over the last 10 years, you know, what we have seen is the new generation of Tibetans who are growing up in these boarding schools right now. As soon as they join boarding school, within a year, within a couple of years, all these Tibetan kids start speaking to each other in Chinese. And when Tibetans talk to Tibetans in Chinese, in Tibet, where, you know, on the land where Tibetans have lived for centuries and millennia, then that can be extremely dangerous. That it's a really, really serious phase for Tibet as a civilization. So yeah, I think this moment is extremely concerning and scary and urgent for Tibet as a whole.
And important to point out that when you say Tibetans are speaking to the Chinese to each other in Tibet, I think it's important to point out where Tibetans are still the majority in most places. Like, it's not
absolutely
as if Tibetans are swamped with Chinese, and that there's a reason why, you know, in that sense, that it's easier to operate in Chinese.
Right.
Just quickly, to a little bit more about the life in the schools, or what we know about the conditions in the schools, because I think that's one thing people are always really interested in, is how are they treated, and you know, are they abused, are they tortured, or what's happening to them in these schools? I don't know, Freya, if you wanted to just address that a little bit about what we know or what we don't know, or...
Sure. This is one of the first things I think people think of, partly because of the obvious parallels here to other colonial boarding school systems that were put in place with the same intent, obviously, like in Canada, in the US, in Australia. And we all know that those systems have had a horrific legacy of abuse of the kids that went through them. This is one of the things that's so hard to find out information about because of the lockdown and the communication blackout that China keeps over Tibet. So, you know, who knows what students would tell us or parents would tell us if they could speak openly. Yeah, nobody can answer that question. What we were able to find out is from Tibetans who went to boarding schools in earlier periods, some in the early 2000s, even the 90s and late 80s. They had some pretty harrowing stories. Some definitely involved abuse. Others, well, different kinds of abuse. So a lot of abuse along the lines of neglect and insufficient like hygiene and food, and maybe more longer lasting impacts, maybe stories of being treated as inferior, or having the sense that they were not the right people. They weren't Chinese enough. So we can certainly imagine that might be going on. Now, there's also information, though, that there have been huge injections of money, especially into some of these newly built boarding schools, that they do give kids good food, that in some cases kids want to go because the food they get at school is better than what their parents are able to afford to buy them. So conditions could be great. These schools would still be just as problematic in terms of their goal of wiping out Tibetans as a people. And they might be really bad in some cases, and we don't know.
Yeah, we definitely, what we got a sense of, I guess, from the very few academic studies that we could see, or even looking at the propaganda, I think, because there is a lot of shiny propaganda online, slick videos, Chinese government, state media stories, right, that show you some of these boarding schools. And I guess what we were able to find from, what was available to us, we could see that the kids themselves express, even in the state media stories, real longing for home, right? Missing home. Sort of, it comes through in one particular report. We put in the report that's for a Chinese, I don't know if it's a CCTV story, but the young man just talking so longingly about his home and his traditional life, and how kind of expressing how much he missed it. And the academic studies, I don't know if either of you wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the ideas that we've seen or that were expressed in terms of the psychological, emotional picture of these little ones. Some of them not so little, but a lot of them little. From, just from what we could tell from the little bit of research that's been done.
I mean, in terms of impact on children, I think there's plenty of evidence that shows that children who have been separated from their parents, or children who are forced to live separately from their family, their parents, they just grow up different. And even among our friends who grew up in the 70s and 80s in Tibet, when they were sent to the inland Chinese boarding school system back then, which was the kind of the elite, what do you call that, like the cutting edge of the program that were trying to, like a colonial program that are trying to transform Tibetans into Chinese clerks, basically, right? In those cases, almost everyone who has had that experience has told us, how they have been affected psychologically, individually, in terms of their confidence, in terms of their social interactions. I think there was no way to put a measure on how devastating that loss has been for them. It's basically stealing somebody's childhood, right? And also, I think in terms of treatment, in the pictures that we have seen now, like the classified kind of pictures we have seen, one thing that is striking is, on the whole, there was a pattern where children, as long as anybody is separated from their parents, we can almost be certain that they are not being treated well, right? There is no doubt about it. So at the structural level, I think there is definitely going to be a pattern of negligence, a pattern of children not receiving enough love, enough care, enough emotional attention. There is no doubt about that. At the same time, I think there are some places or some institutions where, like Freya, you said, the Chinese government has injected like this huge boost of cash just into these schools, into facilities, into like the shiny new buildings or shiny new kind of classroom facilities, and maybe like better food or whatnot. I think that definitely exists, right? And yeah, like you said, that doesn't make this whole program any more legitimate, this whole program any less illegal in a sense. And to me, this actually, the way they are injecting all of this money into some of these key institutions within the network, it reminds me of precisely what the Chinese government did that when the Chinese troops first came into Tibet during the invasion. And all older Tibetans have this memory of the first days, the first months of invasion, when the Chinese actually brought so much money. They brought so much cash, and the Tibetans called them Dayang. And there was actually a Tibetan saying, the Chinese brought so much Dayang cash into Tibet, and they were giving it out to people, So some of the Tibetans were initially actually fooled. They were lured and they were fooled into taking this money, and they were fooled into actually lending some support to the invading Chinese forces, actually. And now looking back, when we know this fact, the fact that the Chinese government, along with like unlimited violence and brutality, also used some of these like honey coated kind of sword or candy or whatever, doesn't make their invasion any more legitimate, right? And I think in that sense, right now, what we see in some of these areas where parents never want to part with their children because they want to send their children to the existing village schools, the monastic schools, the private schools, which now the Chinese government has shut them down. And in order to force these new kind of consolidated colonial boarding schools down their throat, they also have to offer something. And this injection of cash is exactly the same as the Chinese invading forces bringing in that Dayang cash into Tibet. So I think to me, they're like, those are precisely the same, and those are precisely the Chinese occupiers' tactics. There are manuals about this kind of stuff, so they know what they're doing. And I think Tibetans will soon find out what they're doing as well.
Yeah, considering how many children are now living in these schools, if you think of just the sheer numbers, I mean, right now, from the most recent census data, it looks like 7 million Tibetans in Tibet, and of course some in China. 7 million, say, roughly in total. And we're talking about, as Freya said, low numbers, 800,000 to 900,000 at least. So potentially 1 in every 7 Tibetans living in these boarding schools, cut off from family, cut off from Tibetan community and traditional Tibetan life or practice of Buddhism, and facing, the certain death of Tibetan language, at least amongst this whole generation. The idea that some good food and a shiny building is going to make that, makes that okay. It just obviously doesn't. But it is certainly the first thing the Chinese government will point to, is that these kids are, in good modern facilities, getting this modern education, getting this CCP fueled Chinese nationalist education, and at the expense of everything.
Yeah, one of the early propaganda articles that I read about, I think a school in Kanze, though I can't remember for sure. It included stuff about, various modern elements, but then also that at the end of a long day, the students could come home and they had piped water from the nearby hot spring in so that they could soak their tired feet in a foot bath, which I think is a good captures well what you guys are talking about. It's like, oh yes, how nice, you have a great soak for your feet, but you don't have the comfort of your parent as you have dinner and go to sleep.
Yeah, and to think, so I mean, that is a big part of this too, is that the Chinese will say that these kids are all getting education and getting this opportunity to go to school in a way. Tibet's the challenges of educating children in Tibet with it's such a vast expanse of space and so rural, and these far-flung nomadic communities, and there are so many challenges to try to provide good education, let alone conditions, but good education to opportunities for Tibetans in Tibet. That this is the way to do it, to take them to boarding schools. This is what you have to do in rural areas. Is the distances are just too great for the kids to travel every day to school. And I don't know, what do we say to that? And what do we know about, because the consolidation of schools happen all over China. What do we know about the situation for Tibetans versus Chinese and children in rural areas that are sort of comparable, or the consolidation of schools in China as compared to Tibet?
Well, the school consolidation in particular, we know that, they actually rolled it out earlier in China, and parents pushed back so much that they had to cancel it a decade later. And instead of canceling it in areas like Tibet or East Turkestan, they had put in a new rule that called for continuation and expansion and faster pace for building boarding schools in those areas. So there's a real double standard, and it's quite clear in the numbers that even looking at rural areas of China proper, there's just no comparison. There are boarding schools still, but I don't have the statistics right in front of me here, but there's just, it's very clear when you look at it that there's other forces at work here. There's a reason that they're trying to push Tibetans into boarding schools. Yes, for practicality, in some places, boarding schools exist elsewhere too, but there is just no comparison.
Yeah, I think I'm the one number that 14% in one rural province of China, 14% of kids were in boarding, as compared to in elementary school children, primary age children, whereas compared to the Tibet Autonomous Region or Central Tibet alone, I think we have 79% of all primary elementary school age children in boarding schools. So obviously just no comparison. And the state council, I mean, on the one hand, I think in 2012, before Xi Jinping came to power, they said that in principle, all schooling should be, local, especially for grades 1 to 3. And then you have 2015, and the same state council issues a decision on so-called minority education in China, and decrees that minority areas, so Tibet, East Turkestan, southern Mongolia, that all kids should live in a school, grow up in a school, that they should all be boarding. The decision on ethnic education, I think that's the same state council. And then, of course, we know this idea that the 4 and 5-year-olds are being sent to boarding preschools. So forget talking about grades 1 to 3. We're talking about tiny little people just out of toddlerhood. I mean, I have a 5-year-old. You have what do you have, Freya? Your guys are...
I have 4 and 6-year-olds, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that that's exactly the age that they would go, our kids are exactly the age that they should be going to live in rural areas, at least, in boarding preschools. So...
Yeah, and one of the most heart-wrenching quotes that we have in the report is from a teacher who gets these kids, I think she said at age 7, but in her area they all go to boarding preschool at age 4, and she said they have their nursery rhymes and their bedtime stories all in Chinese, and by the time they come to her school, none of them can speak Tibetan. And just that picture of those young kids, yes, my kid's age, your kid's age, being put to bed by people they have no connection to and in a language that they didn't grow up speaking. I mean, how much work does a kid put into getting to wherever they are at age 4 in their mother tongue, and then they're being soothed to sleep in a different language by strangers? It's just heartbreaking.
Yes, heartbreaking, enraging, I think is a word I used recently. Just the idea that they're these kids, I mean, obviously the little ones rip our hearts out, but all of these kids, that they're being denied the love and comfort and security of their families and their parents. It intentionally, so that language, culture, and identity is not transmitted, is just, it's enraging. And as to why of all of this, why they're doing this, Tender, you talked about it, but just a little bit, maybe we could speak to what the actual shift has been, or what what's different now, like why this approach now. China's been, of course, working on undermining, dismantling, destroying Tibetan life and culture for a long time now. But this whole program, the colonial boarding schools, the common language or bilingual education, so-called bilingual education, the move from Model 1, Chinese medium instruction, Tibetan medium instruction, to Model 2, Mandarin or Chinese medium instruction for Tibetan kids. Like, what is this? What's changed, and what's it all about?
I mean, one thing that I've often heard from people who look at the longer kind of historical arc of what's changed in terms of China's policy is, there being two wings of two schools of thought. Those who are slightly more liberal, who favor or who argue that cultural autonomy for Tibetans and Uyghurs and other nationalities or other peoples within the borders of China would be the way to go forward. And then those hardline Xi Jinping kind of school of thought, and I think people who, among the academics who belong to this school of thought, would be counted someone like Ma Rong, who has written a lot of stuff on this topic, that if China is to survive as an empire, then there has to be some kind of cultural uniformity across the PRC. And what that means is, cultural uniformity, meaning everybody has to speak Chinese, everybody has to speak Mandarin, everybody has to turn Mandarin into their first language. So it seems that school of thought has won out. I don't know whether in the early 2000s or whatnot, but I think that's one way to look at it, I think. But generally, Tibetans are not the same as the other 56 whatever minorities that the Chinese government talks about. Uyghurs are not the same as all of these smaller minorities. Many of these smaller minorities are basically made up by the Chinese government. They picked out groups of people who dress slightly differently in remote mountains of China and called them, okay, they are going to be called X kind of minority. Someone else is going to be Y kind of minority. And, we have heard that some of these smaller minorities, they themselves were surprised when they found their own names among the list of minorities of China, right? Because they have been Chinese for ages and ages. And so when it comes to the Tibetan people and the Uyghurs, and I think, Southern Mongolians might be included in that, but these are nations. These are peoples who have their own separate civilization, their own separate language, their own separate way of being in this world, their own separate literature, and the Chinese government cannot swallow that, right? And I think they see Tibetan civilization, which is so distinct. Anybody who has been to Tibet immediately can see that Tibetans are not Chinese. Anybody who's been there, anybody who communicates and interacts with Tibetan ordinary people, in any town of Tibet or village, they can see that actually, Tibet, it doesn't look like Tibet has ever been part of China. So it completely goes against the Chinese version of the story that Tibet has always been a part of China. And since they cannot win this debate, I think the Chinese government feels extremely insecure that as long as the Tibetan people with their distinct civilization and distinct language remain a separate people with their own separate identity that is not Chinese, there will always be a threat that in the future, Tibetans will have aspirations, political aspirations of being free as a people, and same goes for Uyghurs. And I think that insecurity is basically driving part of the picture that drives Xi Jinping and the current Chinese leadership to go for these genocidal policies of basically deciding to destroy this entire civilization, entire Tibetan civilization, in order to preserve the Chinese empire. And I think for them, if the price of preserving China's colonial empire is the destruction of an entire Tibetan civilization, then for them, that's the price they are willing to pay, I think.
And I think what should just be emphasized with all of that is that, elements of this attitude have been around forever, and maybe before China's actual occupation, I think there's been a long-standing sort of Chinese view of superiority, right? But it's Xi Jinping who's really taken these ideas and fast-tracked them and really explicitly made clear that from the youngest ages, the goal is to alter people's thoughts, to alter people's behaviors, and transform them over time. And so these ideas have been around. They may have gotten, they may have won out the second generation ethnic policies. Those may have won out anyway, but it was Xi who really took them and made them a centerpiece of his policy towards Tibet and towards the East Turkestan. And that's what we can see in the cruelty and the all-out onslaught on both of those groups. This tremendous fear of difference and this determination to just flatten it all out and force people to truly once and for all become Chinese. And the irony, it seems to me, is that it's of course doomed to fail, but because you can't change who people are, as we can see with Indigenous people where I am, but what you can do is cause immense suffering right now and for future generations to come. The trauma of these policies, the trauma of people losing their language, losing their culture, losing their communities, having being alienated from their history and who they are. It's just potentially causing such devastation. And I think, it's easy to slide into talking about this stuff as if it's a sure thing. And I think it's important to stay aware that it's not. Xi Jinping is driving this with all his might, and Tibetans are getting more and more concerned, and more people are trying to slow it down and figure out other options and keep Tibetan language alive and thriving in whatever small ways are possible, and start to really push back and reverse this system that's in place.
Yeah, and to keep in mind that, these kids can be targeted for their entire school careers, and, the attempt to make them and to replace their Tibetan identity with a Chinese identity may be successful to a certain point, but they leave those schools and they have to live in the real world. And the real world, as we know, is one where Tibetans face intense racism and discrimination and barriers to success and to work and to just their life in every way, as Tibet is a occupied country, and the colonial master doesn't actually look or people, they don't look at Tibetans as equal and as Chinese and as, they look at Tibetans as backward and as less than, as maybe a little brother. I think that's, little brother or sister, that might be kind. But certainly that's the language that we see. It's like, Tibetans are not equal and they're not Chinese, and everything in their lives will tell them that as they move and live in China or under Chinese rule. And so what happens to these young people when they, there's something someone said to us recently about they're getting this intense nationalistic education and they're not getting Tibetan cultural values and Buddhist, influence and everything in the way that they would if they were with their families and going to the monastery and just living in more, being able to be Tibetan kids. And what will happen is they're going to have this intense sense of nationalism, except they're going to know they're not Chinese. And so what is their nationalism? What does it turn to? When do they turn inward and say, yeah, we're not Chinese, we're Tibetan. And we have a strong sense of the importance of this national identity. And so it backfires in the long run, I think. But so much suffering and immeasurable damage and harm in the meantime. So that's why we're pushing on it. That's why we're fighting. And as our Tibetan friend from Tibet said to us recently, right, Tenor, that so many divisions, so much tension, so much fighting behind the scenes in the party. It's not all said and done yet. You have to make this an issue and make Tibet an issue, because right now it's just Xi Jinping's way, but that doesn't mean it's the only way, and that doesn't mean it's forever. And aside from fighting this because it's right and what they're doing is wrong, we have to fight to close the colonial boarding schools, to return Tibetan children to their parents, for them to have the right to be educated in Tibetan at home from Tibet by Tibetan teachers with a Tibetan curriculum that reflects them and their life and our national history and everything. That is the key. I mean, that's what we're working for. And this is just the first of a series of conversations. We'll talk about recommendations and action and advocacy in the next part to this. But thanks for joining. Thanks for talking.